Okay, so this is pretty exciting. Welcome everyone to our first ever Generous Space webinar. We're really excited about launching this new way of training and learning as a community. We have about 60 facilitators as we speak across the country, and I think there's people signed in from multiple provinces. I'm not sure exactly who's on here, but I know there's some Ontarians and Nova Scotians, and we've got, I'm actually sitting in Vancouver in a room that's right next to where Sarah and Sharon, our presenters, are sitting, so that's kind of fun too. Eric is with us, Wendy's with us. Great to have all of you. And just as we begin, I just want to talk a little bit about Sanctuary. So Sanctuary Mental Health Ministries is somewhat local here to Vancouver, but I think that they do a lot of work across the country, coaching. And I was just pulling up their statements, sort of their vision statement. They prepare people of faith to support mental health and mental health recovery in the community. So we've identified at Generous Space that mental health is something we want to learn a lot more about, specifically suicide prevention. We've had all kinds of people, all kinds of facilitators talking about how that's a real need. And we know that LGBT people, especially who've been through traumatic experiences with spirituality and church, have a higher incidence of mental illness. And so it's something we really want to understand. So I'm grateful, Sarah and Sharon, that you've prepared so much for us to learn today. And just invite participants to keep yourselves muted, your microphones and your videos, and then we'll have some chances to ask questions. But if you have questions as we go, just type them into the chat, and I will be acting as sort of the chat monitor to interrupt Sarah and Sharon if there's something kind of pressing for them to deal with. But there will be some moments through their presentation when they'll invite us to reflect on things. So I'd encourage you to interact on the chat and to enjoy their presentation. So thank you again, Sarah and Sharon, and you can introduce yourselves. I'm really grateful to have this time with you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Beth. We're going to introduce ourselves a little bit down the way. I just want to introduce the topic for just a moment, because you're seeing a slide in front of you that doesn't say suicide prevention. It says suicide awareness and support training. And just a word about that. It is both Sarah and my conviction that we can't prevent a suicide. But what we can do is support someone to make a better choice. And that is why that title is there. I wonder if we should introduce ourselves and then go into the prayer. What do you think?
Sure.
Okay, so if you could go to slide 3. And let me introduce myself first. So my name is Sharon. I originally, when I graduated high school, I started in as an occupational therapist. It seems like way too long ago to actually talk about, but I worked as an occupational therapist in mental health for about 20 years, and specifically in acute mental health, which means that people were coming into the ward that I was working at the worst times in their life. And I was in conversation with many people following a suicide attempt, and then working through the stages of recovery with them. And that was both in South Africa, which is where I was born, and then later when I immigrated to Vancouver, Canada, I carried on here as well. I then moved on to do a PhD in occupational therapy, and I focused on the spiritual lives of people living with a mental illness. And so I began to integrate both my theological, my Christian understanding, a broader spirituality understanding, with the lived experience of what it means to live with a mental health diagnosis or any kind of mental health or illness experiences. Beth and I actually met in a year when I was kind of this interim executive director at Jacob's Well on the downtown east side. And following that, I was one of the founders of Sanctuary, which is the organization that Sarah and I are representing today. Since then, I have become an Anglican priest. That's another sort of little surprise in my life. I strategically left Sanctuary after 8 years of being the founder, and transitioned out, and it was a wonderful succession. We have a lovely executive director, Dan Whitehead, now, and I have moved into being a priest at an Anglican community, St. Catherine's in North Vancouver. My relationship, though, with mental health is something that I wanted to also emphasize, and perhaps that's where I have had my most profound education, is through lived experience. So it started off with my mum, who continues to live with an undiagnosed anxiety disorder. And I found myself actually being taught how to be codependent. I grew up learning how to be codependent in my life because of my mum's anxiety disorder. And I married a man who we didn't know at the time lived with bipolar mood disorder. And after just under 10 years of marriage, he ended his life by suicide. And that has been my going through that grief, going through that experience within Christian community has been one of the hardest and the most profound experiences that I've had in life to date. And I hope it doesn't get much worse than that. So that's my own experience. And it turned into a bit of a complicated grief story for me. I experienced my own mental health issues during that grieving experience, and then have continued to wrestle around what it means to be single now, and then also living with this tendency towards codependence, what it means to companion people without rescuing. And that's been a continued journey for me. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah to introduce herself.
Well, that's a hard thing to follow up on, Sharon. Yeah, I'm Sarah, and as you can see from this picture, I'm in process. I think as we all are. We're building our lives, and sometimes they fall apart and we start over, and yeah, we're always in the middle of something, I like to think. So I used to work in the downtown east side here in Vancouver, and actually I used to serve Beth lunch back in the day. So it's very cool to be together around a table as opposed to across a counter. And I have 2 young children, and I live in New West. And yeah, I have a lot of experience with mental illness myself, as well as in my family. So in my extended family, there is psychosis, there is bipolar, there's ADHD, there is anxiety. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that has gone down in the past and continues to be challenging. And oftentimes my role in that has been the support or the advocate person. And I have walked someone through multiple suicidal thoughts and attempts. And so that's my lived experience around that. And it's an honor to be here today, because Sharon was the person who actually pulled me into Sanctuary. And Sanctuary was a sanctuary for me. After I had my first baby, I really struggled. And Sanctuary coach training was the very first thing I did when I actually left the house without my baby. And it was a huge deal for me to jump back into life and realize I still had skills and something to offer. And it really, maybe saved isn't the right word, but Sanctuary was a place where I could be myself again after a period of crisis. So it's an honor to be here today to share with everybody. And as well, I work for an organization that trains shelter workers across the province via webinar, and we talk about a lot of these topics, especially for people who are on the front line. And so, yeah, I'm here and I'm happy to be here.
This is not an easy topic for us. In fact, Sarah and I were saying every time we came to have to a time when we'd set up to prepare, we had this sort of heaviness over us of going, oh gosh, here we are again in this. And I want to acknowledge that for all of us, that it may bring up all kinds of thoughts and emotions. It may evoke some personal memories for us, maybe some shame, some fear, some sadness, and memories of others in our lives that might stir feelings maybe of helplessness, or fear or grief, and any other emotions that I haven't mentioned. So remember that you are always free to take some space, and actually a webinar platform is wonderful for that. So if you need to walk away and have some breath, that's okay. I ask that if you do move away, try your best to come back. If you can't, because you just feel it, you're emotionally a little overwhelmed, I ask that you just reach out to a trusted person today, and that you don't spend the rest of the evening on your own, particularly if you have been triggered in some way. So as a way to hold our conversation, Sarah and I both are part of the Christian faith, and we would love to just start with a prayer. And so let's just take a moment of quiet as we enter this topic. And I will pray with a pause to give some more silence, and then we'll move into the topic. Let's pray. God is our light and our salvation. God, you command a light to shine out of darkness. We are mindful of the dark times that we and many around us are facing. We ask that you shine in our hearts, that we may be as lights in this world, reflecting the glory of Jesus in our lives. Amen.
So as Sharon and I were talking through this topic, we realized that this is actually very common. And we wanted to make everybody feel comfortable with talking about suicide, because I think that is part of the fear. That's part of the, I don't know how to handle this when somebody tells you that they're feeling suicidal, because we don't talk about it in everyday life. And as Sharon said, there was a block even for us to work through the material because it's kind of heavy. But let's just all come to the table here. This is anonymous. I think Beth will either run a poll. Oh, perfect. It's up on the screen now. So if you've experienced suicidal thoughts or behavior, or supported someone who has, just let us know. It's anonymous. We can't see who is picking the answer, but it just gives us a sense of who's in the room. And to be honest, I have myself, as well as supporting other people through this. I have also been suicidal and experienced that crisis. So I think that we can kind of say that part of what we do when we support other people is to recognize that we come from a place of humility, and the way that we can help others is to identify with them and to not feel better than them, or like that we haven't gone through what they have, but just to have an understanding that it's happened to a lot of people, and we all struggle in different ways. And so, Sharon and I are sitting across a beautiful wooden table on the same level. And so even, when you're online supporting someone, if you can just think about that balance there, they have something to offer, as do you, and you have suffering and crisis that you've been through that you can actually use as a way to identify and support someone else. And it looks like 100% of the people here today have either experienced those thoughts or supported someone who has. And yeah, I mean, I'm getting goosebumps at the moment, but I just want to honor that experience. And I want to honor the fact that you are here. You're here today. You made it. That's amazing. So thank you for sharing that.
Let us take you through the course outline, just so that you know what you can be expecting in the next hour and 45 that we have left. So Sarah's going to take us through an approach to mental health and faith, just to get us caught up on the same page. Now, Beth has shared with us that you have been in conversation about this topic, and specifically from a lived experience perspective, which is fantastic. That's just the way that we like to learn as well. Because even though we may have a professional background, someone who's walking through living with a mental health issue is the expert on this topic, on what it means to actually be experiencing this. So that's going to take some time. After that, we'll have a little bit of time for reflection, but we don't want to get into a lot of questions around that, because our main topic is around suicide awareness and support. So then we've divided it based on Beth's questions that I think were polled from all of you. We've divided it into 3 sections. So we're going to talk about exactly what do we mean by suicide, and do some differentiation between self-harm and some of the other pieces that come up in this topic. And I'll present some content, and then we're going to have some conversation. So that's the time when Beth is going to actually bring forward any of the questions that you may have typed into the chat. And Sarah and I will have a conversation at that point as well, back and forth. We'll shift gears and then start talking about what it means to actually companion someone. And we've divided this companioning into 2 sections. One is on when someone is acutely suicidal. And what we mean by that is when someone is in the moment. It might be a new experience for them. It's definitely new for you to be walking with them. And so it's new, it's fresh, it's kind of a real warm moment, really hot moment in a relationship. But there is another time when suicide shows up, and that's when you're journeying with someone over a long period of time, and suicides actually become a pattern of conversation in the relationship. So we divided that up into 2 sections. So you'll see there's 2. There's the companioning someone who's acutely suicidal. Again, we'll do content with conversation. And then we'll look at long-term depression and suicidal patterns, again with content and conversation. So I hope that's going to meet our needs today, and we'll try and keep to the time that we have together. So Sarah.
All right, well, I just want to give a shout out to Beth, because I have a feeling that a lot of you have a lot of education around this idea of mental health. And to the organization of Generous Spaces, I know that they work hard to train and support their staff and volunteers, and really make this front and center. Because in a lot of organizations, mental health isn't something that's even talked about. So I'm going to kind of go from the understanding that there is some knowledge out there, but we're just going to kind of get on the same page so that we all have the same definition that we're working from. And I'm going to take us through this quite quickly, but there are 2 sort of key there's 3 here. So I'm going to talk about the first 2, flourishing and languishing, and the recovery model. And then Sharon's going to talk a little bit about faith and mental health and how they work together. Some of you may have seen this before. This is what's called the mental health continuum, and it was put together based on the research by a man named Dr. Corey Keyes. And what he found over the course of a lot of studies and a lot of research was that people don't necessarily need to be having a bad time just because they have a mental illness. And people who had a diagnosis, in some cases, actually were doing really well. And I'll just state that another way, because this is kind of a key concept. So oftentimes in society, we think we can kind of label people, well, like take me, for example. I have an anxiety disorder. And so if people know that about me, they generally just assume that I'm like that all the time, and that I can't really function in my life, and that it colors everything I do. Now, there are definitely times where that is true. But there are lots of times where I'm actually flourishing. And so if you look at this cross here on the screen, you can see that there are 4 quadrants. And mental health and mental illness are on opposite sides, but you can be flourishing with or without a mental illness. Flourishing means you're doing well, you're thriving, you feel like you can function in your life, you can connect with people, you can do what is required of you. Languishing, again, you don't have to be having a bad time or be in crisis. Sorry, don't is the wrong adjective there. You can be having a bad time without having mental illness. And I just want to sort of draw us into this. Think about your day today. Where would you put yourself on this diagram? Would you be closer to the flourishing end of things? You've had a great day, things have been going well for you. Or would you kind of be closer to languishing on this line here? And the reason that we talk about this continuum is just to really drill it into you, to give you the sense that mental illness is not a predictor of being okay or being not okay. And the idea behind that is that we are all equals. You cannot judge someone based on their diagnosis, and you can't judge them based on their mood. And it's important to remember that and to then locate yourself on this. So when you're supporting someone who is in crisis, again, like I said earlier, you can actually think back to when you were languishing and think, oh, I might not know what this particular situation feels like, but I know what it's like to be languishing. I know what it's like to be in the depths. I know what it's like to feel out of control in crisis. And that is where compassion comes from. And compassion is key to recovery and support. So that's the continuum, something to kind of tuck away. It's sort of a core teaching of Sanctuary. And then this definition of mental illness I really like. Again, it's pretty straightforward, but I'm going to just read it over a couple of times and let it sink in. So it's an internal crisis that is externalized and unmanaged. Again, that's an internal crisis that is externalized, so it's presenting outwardly, and it's not being managed. Now, I can't see your hands, but how many of you have actually had this happen? Yeah. Sharon, you might need to correct me on the stat here, but I think it's 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a mental health crisis in their lifetime. So we have we've got quite a few participants here. If there are 5 people in a room, one of them will have or is experiencing a mental health crisis. And again, the idea behind this definition is to take away any idea of stigma that you might have around mental illness, that is us and them. We actually all can flourish, we all can languish, and we have all been in a place where we have been in crisis internally that is pouring out of us and we are not able to manage. So that's, yeah, and that is a painting by Turner there, just in case you were curious. And then we move into this definition of recovery, and this is another key concept when we're talking about mental health and mental illness. And the idea here is that recovery is not a journey from A to B. So we often talk about recovery as a journey, but it's not like, I'll use myself as an example. I had a really bad time with anxiety, but then I saw a psychiatrist and then I took medication and now I'm all better and everything's fine. Wouldn't that be amazing? But that's not actually how life works, and it's not how recovery works. We often go back and forth. We go up and down, we go sideways. We can go in all different directions on a recovery journey. The idea is that it's not a straight line, it's a process. The other key thing to note here is that it's individual and unique for each person. So what works for me on my recovery journey may totally not work for you. And so when you are supporting people through recovery or through crisis, remember the first thing you don't want to do is say, well, this is what worked for me. That might help them. They might ask you for advice, but remember, it's about your individual recovery. The definition here is that it's a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. And Sharon and I were talking about this, the idea that we have this idea of what potential is, that we're all going to reach this certain bar, but actually somebody's full potential could be totally different than yours. My full potential at the moment is that I'm able to drive here and not freak out about it. So, you know, that's where I'm at on my journey, and that's my current full potential. But for someone else, they drive every day and it's not a big deal. So again, this is just to kind of give you a platform of definitions that we're standing on. And then the other key thing here, again, we'll get into this later, but it's a self-directed process. So you can't make someone recover. You can't push them down the road of recovery, and you can't tell them how to recover. It's up to them when they are ready, as they are able, to their potential. So there we go. Let's just take, oh, that's right, Sharon. I'm so sorry. There's one slide that we're missing. So I'm just going to hand it over to Sharon, and she's going to talk about faith and mental health here.
Just very briefly, to give us a sense of how we hold this together. Not many churches do this well. I think often we will separate out based on our understanding of how a human person is divided up. We sort of divide people up into the spiritual lives and the physical lives and our bodies and our minds. And part of it is that we've got these church institutions that deal with the spiritual. We've got the medical institutions that deal with the body. We've got psychologists that deal with the mind. And so we have disconnected things. The perspective that we're going to be taking today is that all experience happens in parallel. So if I'm experiencing something, my body is experiencing it, my mind is experiencing it, my spirit is experiencing it, and it is experienced also within the relationships in the community. And it happens in parallel. We can't divide it up. Therefore, mental health issues affect our faith journey. And our faith holds us up within the process of recovery, the back and forwardness of it. The other piece we always emphasize at Sanctuary is that persons who are courageously journeying on the recovery process are working out their faith in a way that those who are not on that journey may not know how deep that faith process is. And it's got lots of questions. It's up and down, but it is a courageous spiritual journey, the journey of mental health recovery. And so we see these two as intertwined. And so when someone, for example, is experiencing a depression, they may have loads of questions, but they are faithful questions because they're asking them and they are continuing to be at least engaged in some kind of conversation with their community. They may not be praying at this time, but God is holding them. And it doesn't mean that their faith has disappeared. It means that their faith is being expressed differently as they're journeying on this journey of parallel in their bodies, their minds, their spirits, and in community. So I'm not going to say too much more about that. We'll talk about some faith issues that come up with the specific question around suicide, but everything is very intertwined through this recovery process.
All right. Amazingly, we are on time according to our schedule. Thank you for listening to all of that. It takes a minute to sink in. So let's just have a moment. We're not going to take too long here, but are there any questions around definitions or things you just really need to get clear on before we proceed? And Beth is just going to monitor that. Sharon, as we're waiting for those questions to come in, I just really love that faithful questions. Mm-hmm. You know, this idea that people are, again, it's this idea that you can't judge someone based on where they're currently at. You have to think about them as a whole person. their whole life is about, and where they've come from and where they're going. You know, I was thinking again about Beth and I meeting at very different points in our lives. I was a burnt out, stressed out cafeteria worker in the downtown east side. And Beth was at a different point in her journey. And I actually had a moment of like, oh, I hope she doesn't think that I was rude to her back then.
No way.
Maybe I was, and that was where I was at in my life at the time. But yeah.
No, we do have one question. So
Yeah.
going back to your slide, I think it was the definition that was over the Turner painting.
Yes.
Wendy's asking if it was a definition of mental health crisis or mental illness, and how those are different.
That's a good question. Sharon, do you want to elaborate?
So the question, just to reiterate, is around whether we're talking about a mental illness crisis or whether this is a definition of mental illness. Well, you know, it's so fuzzy. We think that within the professional realm of mental health workers that we know when someone has a mental illness, they're in this category, and when someone doesn't, they're in that category. When someone has a mental illness, they have been given a diagnosis. Like, that's when we say it is a clinical depression or a clinical anxiety, or whatever that language is. It is when someone has walked into a professional's office who has the ability to then say, well, this is mild, moderate, or severe, and then there is a diagnosis that's given. And then over time, that person will experience languishing and flourishing along the way, but they are living with this diagnosis and trying to work out what it means for them. And the diagnosis is really a social construct. It's something that's been given to this particular experience. So this definition here is really what you could say for those moments when you're languishing. In the languishing moment, there is this internal crisis that is externalized and unmanaged. And so that then is an experiential definition for the languishing, whether you have a mental illness or whether you have not been diagnosed. And I always say yet, because the way our DSM is being carried on, there'll be a diagnosis for every one of us if we look hard enough. But yeah, no, that's a really important thing. And I think when it's externalized, that's when the social constructs of diagnoses then get given, or we put onto ourselves, because it's being externalized into the social area, into the social.
That was another question there, just around the need to include the word externalized in mental illness, since it can be quite internalized. Ash was asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think externalized just refers to, are you functioning, right? And so it's this idea that I live with a mental illness and I have a diagnosis, but there are times when I'm functioning and I can do everything that is within my area of responsibility. I'm able to enjoy my friends and family. I'm able to do the work I need to. I'm able to experience a range of emotions. But there are times when that crisis is actually out there. Now, there are times when I do not exhibit anxiety. And so, yeah, I see where she's getting at. I think the important thing to remember is that it's actually not about checking a box here. And when we're talking to people and supporting them, we actually want to stay as far away from putting them into a definition as possible. And so if you can kind of hold these things, I'm asking you to be less detail oriented here, which I know is difficult, but if you can kind of hold this as a concept as opposed to a list, that will help you to understand that mental illness can present and it cannot present. That doesn't mean it's not there, and that doesn't mean it might pop up again as a crisis later. And it might mean that you're managing it or you're not managing it, and it's hard to kind of tell where you're at in the moment.
Yeah, so we take a very, as you can see, a lived experience perspective, which means that we're saying that mental illness experience or a mental health crisis is a subjective experience. So the person themselves is telling you what's going on. When you get a diagnosis, it then gets objectified, and there will be a social construct that's given to you in the form of a diagnosis. And that diagnosis is helpful in a number of ways. It opens many doors up to receive assistance from mental health professionals. It's helpful because you realize you're not alone, that there are others. You meet criteria that means that there are others that have experienced the same things. It can also become unhelpful because we can live in it and under it. And the way to recovery is actually to live outside of a mental illness diagnosis, to say hello to it. In other words, yes, it's in here, it's part of me, but it's not all of me. I am more than this mental illness diagnosis. So that's what we've tried to do at Sanctuary, is to understand the mental illness as a subjective experience primarily, because there's so much objectifying that actually happens.
And if I could just add, I realize where you might actually be coming from on this question, and that is some mental illnesses are more externalized than others. But that doesn't mean that other people might not be experiencing the result of your illness. So if you are deeply depressed, it feels very internal, and you might stay inside and you might not interact with people. But that is actually a crisis that's being externalized, because what's happening is you might not be able to go to work or connect to your family or that kind of thing. So I just wanted to, that might be what you're getting at. So hopefully that's helpful.
All right, let's change gears and really go into the specifics here around suicide. Having a mental illness diagnosis is one of the major precipitating factors towards suicide. So it is important that we do realize that if somebody is seeing a professional and they have been given a diagnosis, that it is one of the determining factors that someone might land up in this place where they are voicing suicide. But that's not necessarily the case. Suicide may not be connected to mental illness. Sometimes it is connected to physical illness that is unresolvable and someone is in too much pain physically. So it's not always a one-to-one connection. So let's just look at what is suicide. So if we look at the next slide there, a few things here. We are not going to be talking about medically assisted dying, even though that can be wrapped into this topic. We just only have 2 hours together, so we're not going to go there together. When we talk about suicide, we are talking about intentional. So someone is intentionally themselves wanting to end their life. It is self-inflicted. They're wanting to do it to themselves, and because they want to die, if they let somebody else know, someone will intervene and stop them. So it is an act against oneself. And here's the piece that we really do want to emphasize, is that it is motivated by a desire usually to stop pain or to solve a problem that just seems so overwhelming that somebody doesn't know which way to turn. And by stopping pain, intrapsychic pain is a very difficult thing to explain. And so when you read first-person accounts, some people will say that it feels like inside that all 4 limbs are being sawn off at the same time. It's that painful, and it's excruciating, and they can't get away from it. So it is, when it becomes that severe, we're talking about a real lived experiential pain here that can be compared to a physical pain, but it's intrapsychic pain. When we talk about suicide, another piece I just want to mention is about language. We tend to not talk, and society has moved in this direction as well. We don't want to talk about committing suicide. The language of committing actually comes from the legal system. We commit a crime. Now, suicide used to be considered a criminal offense. And there's a long history. If you look in both church history, and if you look in both civil history, you'll see that there's this idea that comes from a sin that has been committed against God, a crime that then gets committed socially. And so then if we carry the language of committed through, we're carrying some of that conceptual language through, and it's blaming. So it begins to be a person's fault, and we're blaming what's going on. So the language we prefer here is that someone died by suicide. Died by suicide. Some people will also talk about that someone died because of depression. So you don't even need to talk about suicide as the end. But if the experience was depression, often the end results of the depression, a significant depression, might be suicide. So that's some ways that we can talk about suicide. One question that we were asked was about self-harm. So if we could just see the next slide there. This slide differentiates between the two. Now, you noticed in that slide before, we talked about suicide being motivated to end pain. So self-harm is on the left side of your screen and suicide on the right side. Self-harm is actually motivated to feel pain. When someone is numb and they're trying to experience something because there is just an overwhelming numbness inside, often they will cut themselves. Or they will often wrap very tight things around their wrists. I've seen people flick elastics at themselves, or pinch themselves, or twist their skin. That is not really an intention to die. It is an intention to feel. And it is often the person is disconnected with their emotions. And so they will feel bodily pain as a way to experience emotion. You can see how very different that is from the definition that we just presented earlier, where suicide is actually motivated to end pain. The person here is overwhelmed by emotion. They are intricately connected to the emotion, and they are contemplating death. And so the two are quite different. So I don't need to say more than that, just to say that they're quite different. We are not going to talk about recovery and companioning someone through the self-harm experience, just because it's a very different experience. We're obviously going to be talking about suicide awareness and suicide support. So continuing then around this idea of what is suicide, I want to take you through the human process of decision making. So just bracket suicide out for a moment and think about when you are planning to get out of a difficult situation. So for many years, I was living in Vancouver, Canada, and thinking to myself, if things don't work out here, this was the idea that would fly through my mind. If things don't work out here, I can always go back to South Africa. It was kind of my little escape plan. I hadn't become a citizen, and that was the very reason, because I was, could still go back. So when driving along the street, driving along in my car, and I'd be cut off by somebody, and I'd be like, these Canadian drivers. And then the idea would go through my mind, I can always go back to South Africa. So that's an idea. An idea is something that flies through your mind, but it does, you don't hold on to it. It's just there, and it kind of leaves. As Sarah mentioned earlier, most human beings will have ideas of suicide that flit through their mind. You'd watch a movie and you'd see it represented in that. You would hear a story from somebody and the thought might go through your mind. You might be on a high-rise building and suddenly you think, wow, imagine jumping off this. Like it just and it just goes through, but you never actually grasp it and it doesn't become a thought. So it becomes a thought, it becomes more established when we take ownership of it and we hold onto it and we dwell on it for a while, and it begins to enter some of our imagination. That's when it becomes our thought. Now Sharon is actually initiating this thinking process. It can then move on to an habitual thought, which is whenever it begins to be linked with whenever I'm in a difficult situation, now I initiate this thought. And that means it's become settled and habituated. So let's just take me going back to South Africa, so then I'm sitting at work and the boss is crapping all over me again. And, there's that thought again. It happens to me when I'm driving. Now it's happening to me in work, and automatically I'm going, I can just go back to South Africa. So it becomes this habitual thought. And suicidal thinking can be like that. It can be linked to hard times, and I can begin to just keep building on it. I haven't bought my ticket yet to go back to South Africa. I haven't even thought about how much a ticket would cost. I haven't even thought about, so there's no plan. You get the difference? There's no plan yet. It's just a linked thought at this point. It's linked to an emotion, and then the thought happens. That's not a plan yet. The plan happens, and it's just like any human plan. When we start thinking about what, if we were to do this, what would I need? So, in my example, I need to save money, I need to check into jobs, so how you actually would then start thinking through the details of how I would carry this out. And that's when the plan gets put together. So when it's a suicide, you would start thinking the plan would then become quite solidified. So you can have different levels of planning, right? I mean, we know this from the rest of our lives. It's not different from that. You can have over big picture planning, and then it can become specific. And in a suicidal thoughts, when it starts to become specific, that's when it becomes more of a risk. When someone is actually thinking about a certain day, this is when it's going to happen. They've actually bought or collected the means that they're going to use. So they may have bought a gun. They may have researched the pills that would work. They may have looked at how to tie a rope. And unfortunately, if you Google it, there are images and ways to do that. They may have practiced how to actually tie things. They may have thought through how they were going to write the notes, and they may have a list of people they want to write to, ways they want to say goodbye. And then they're waiting for that moment. And often in the plan, this is when someone's mood begins to get better. Because if you think about someone living with excruciating pain or living with an unresolved problem, now they have a solution. Now there is an end to the pain. And so the person actually starts to feel lighter. And that's often a sign, if you're tracking with somebody, that maybe something's going on because they've just something's changed, and you can tell that their disposition has shifted. So here they're waiting. They have this date in mind. You also might see if something gets really bad in their life, it might accelerate the plan. So they may have pre-thought of a date, but then they have a conflict with somebody. And this is when it gets really hard, because we think that, if somebody does end their life by suicide and we're the one that's just had an argument with them, that's when we'd feel tremendous amount of guilt and hardship to process that, especially after somebody's death. But realizing that the plan needed to be well-shaped at this point to actually take a spontaneous action when things got really bad. So there could be some impulsive action that happens even though they have plotted it out carefully based on where their mood might be. So next would be the action. And just want to mention a few things here. We're not going to get into too much detail because we're talking now about, we're going to shift gears into companioning someone and awareness and supporting someone prior to the action, really praying that that action would not be carried out. But when someone does attempt a suicide and they carry it forth, and if it is interrupted and it doesn't work, it is such a deep sense of failure for someone who prior to attempting has put together a plan and is in a place potentially where they're not functioning well. And you often will hear, I have heard many folks would say, I can't even end my own life. Like, I can't do anything. Now I can't even do this. So there's a lot of private shame that happens at this point. And stats show that a person is actually likely to end their life by suicide following an attempt, because it actually does take them into a very difficult space. Recovery following an attempt, or even following an interrupted plan, maybe at this point, is a really slow process. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next section of companioning. So I don't want, because it's not individual. Recovery takes place at its best in community. Before we move to questions around this topic, I did want to talk about suicide and God, just to get a sense of where we are theologically with this. Bearing in mind that when we talk about suicide, we are sitting with some folks' theology would go towards the sin element, which that, is suicide breaking God's law? Well, theologically, God really is the only one who can give and take life. But we also, as Christian people, live with an understanding of Christ. And we live post the cross and post resurrection. And so we live with this additional layer of theology that Christ offers past, present, and future forgiveness. And so our sense when it comes to talking about suicide is to think about suicide and grace, especially when we understand suicide as a response to pain. Because then not only are we thinking about grace, but we're thinking about deep, deep compassion when we understand what it means as well, in terms of this person living with this overwhelmed sense of pain with no way out. And if we can have compassion and grace, how much more the source of love of our universe. Just flip to the next slide there, Sarah. The crux really of our dilemma as Christians is this balance between God's sovereignty and human choice. So let's just read through what that slide says, and then I will talk through a little bit around that dilemma. So some Christian theologies seek to characterize suicide as sinful or as spiritual failure. My theological perspective is simply that suicide is a response to pain, a response that in the light of the resurrection story can seem like the best option someone has in a given moment of despair. God's grace is available to everyone, including those contemplating suicide, those attempting suicide, those who have died by suicide, and the loved ones that they leave behind. So that's a picture that we take. And then the last thing that I'd like to mention, obviously this is a whole webinar on itself, but is that the crux of the dilemma is this balance between God's sovereignty and human beings' choice. Like, is God really in control when someone takes their life or attempts to take their life? Somehow, as someone who has survived the loss of a spouse who died by suicide, I trust that there are times when God can override human choice, but that God also respects human freedom. And this is a mystery of trust. It's a mystery of trusting each other, and it's a mystery of trusting God. And I choose to trust God in spite of this. And I choose to also trust God's choice in giving human freedom, even though I wish I could reverse that sometimes. I choose to trust God in that. So I'm going to pause there for
questions. There were a couple of things that came up just as you were talking, Sharon. One was just going back to the very first differentiation you made between self-harm and suicide. Just wondering if sometimes it can be tough to distinguish between self-harm behavior and suicidal behavior when someone is in more of an ambivalent space. Can you comment on that at all?
Yeah, so I think if somebody is numb and has been numb for many, many years, that could be considered an unresolvable problem for somebody and can then lead to suicide behavior. But the cutting is not going to morph into suicide. Do you know what I mean? It's the numbness that might be the problem that will lead someone to suicide. I don't think that I have come across, and this is, I can only speak for myself. I wonder if Sarah can comment on this. I haven't experienced somebody who has died because they've been cutting, but that's my experience.
Yeah, just to comment on that briefly. I know someone whose suicidal attempts were not really, they didn't really want to die. They just wanted to feel more and feel more adrenaline. And so taking them to the edge of risk, they started out by cutting and then progressed to other forms of self-harm, and then it ended in a continual suicidal attempt. But even those attempts were immediately regretted, and immediately they sought medical attention or help. And so they just pushed it to the edge. So, yeah.
Yeah, that maybe there's a space where sometimes cutting, there's a hope, Ash is saying that you'll cut deep enough possibly to end your own life, but are ambivalent about whether you die. And that maybe cutting can also not just be part of numbness, but also a way to focus in on an emotion.
Right.
Do either of you know anything around that?
You know, I have very little experience with self-harm. But what I think is important here is the intent. Like, I think sometimes the self-harming, you may still put yourself at risk, but the intent may not be escape and death. The intent is to feel, but you still could put yourself at risk for death, but the intent is different. I think that's where, and maybe that's just too categorical. I don't know what happens in a more complicated picture where someone is self-harming and then suddenly becomes overwhelmed, and the self-harming then becomes a suicide attempt. But for guidelines, I think it's helpful that we ask somebody some questions around why are they doing what they're doing, because the pathway to recovery is slightly different. Learning to feel is different from needing to manage your overwhelmed emotion. And learning to manage your overwhelming emotions is what we talk about when we think about suicide risk. Learning to feel and stop cutting is a different pathway of recovery. So that's why we have separated the two.
Yeah, one further thing, there's a lot of people resonating with your definitions of suicide and finding that helpful. Drake was talking about having heard the phrase murdered by suicide or murdered by depression, and wondered what you thought of those phrases.
I actually haven't heard those before. It's an interesting way to think about it. Sure.
I would be cautious around terms like that for a similar reason that, in my mind, and maybe this is just me, I associate those with the criminal justice system as well. So a murder, for me, that kind of is committing a crime, and I think it's a sort of one step away. So what we're trying to do here by talking about died by suicide, there used to be language around someone successfully suicided, and it just, successful suicide doesn't seem to be a good two words to put together. So suicided sometimes is language that people would use, but died by suicide is quite neutral. And that would be my preference to teach people to begin to use.
Yeah, and just some resonance with what you're talking around looking into the reasons why people are exhibiting behaviors being really helpful for recovery and how we respond and support people. So thanks for that.
we have actually another few minutes. If anybody has another question for clarification, we can certainly feel free to post that.
So, I was just thinking, you know, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but we all really like to know very specific solutions. That's part of who we are. That's part of who I am. I'm a big sister. I like to fix things. That's my personality. And I really find knowledge, lists, checklists, definitions really helpful. So I want to acknowledge that for myself. Knowledge is helpful. Definitions are helpful. Categories are very helpful. But I also just want to say again, one of the best ways you can support someone in recovery or in crisis is to be present in that moment without your checklist. Because what they need is your presence. They don't need your advice. They don't need a book of things they should do. And they don't need someone else's experience. They need somebody to be present with them, acknowledging where they're at and saying, I'm here and I see you. And when you say you see someone, you're not looking at a list. And that is really hard for me. Because when you don't have a list, it means you don't have the answer, right? If you don't have a solution that fits everybody, or even a series of solutions, you can feel helpless. And so I just want to recognize that, as we're talking through definitions, it's important to be on the same page in terms of understanding. But at the end of the day, whether we're talking about mental illness or suicide or just meeting with people where they're at, it really is presence first, knowledge second. So I just want to put that out there. And, as somebody who really does love a good self-help book that has all the answers that I can just give to someone. So I just want to acknowledge that that's a conflict, and hopefully you can maybe just take a deep breath and say, I don't have to know everything to be a good friend, and I don't have to know everything to actually help someone. So, yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. I think we're good to move on. Sharon?
Okay. Well, we're going to move now into what it means for us to companion someone, and we're looking particularly at an acute situation. So this is when we've perhaps just encountered their story, so it's someone that's new to us, or it might be new to them as well. So it might be this is somebody's first encounter with a mood that has taken them so low that they're experiencing this, or they are so overwhelmed by something that the ideas have become thoughts, the thoughts have become habitual, and the habitual thoughts are now turning into a plan. So when we companion someone in this moment, and you are concerned because you've seen a couple of warning signs. Now, by warning signs, you potentially have seen somebody withdraw. So some of them are some classical depression symptoms. So you've seen somebody withdraw. You've potentially seen somebody giving away things or naming things, or even affirming people a lot and thanking people for being in their life. You're also seeing somebody who, I'm just going to pull up this note because there is a risk management acronym that's called Is Path Still Warm, that we actually didn't put up.
And while Sharon's doing that, we do recognize that some of this content is for people that you're seeing in person. And we recognize that a lot of the work you're doing is online, and you might not actually even be in the same city as someone. So just bear that in mind. In terms of, there are ways that you can apply this even if you're only interacting online, and that might be through their comments and the patterns that you're seeing through their online presence. Makes it a little bit trickier, but I think that they do translate. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think when we're having a specific relationship with somebody that is located. So when I think about, when I saw clients, it was a time-based period of, I wasn't seeing them at home. I wasn't seeing them in the community. I wasn't seeing them in multiple settings. It was simply one place. And that would be quite similar to what it would be online. You've got to use that time quite carefully. So the questions that you ask need to be carefully thought through. So some of the things we could talk about, and I will get to is path still warm in a moment. I've just found my notes here to page through. Someone might be saying things like, I wish I were dead. People would be better off without me being around. Soon you won't have to worry about me. I can't take this anymore. I'm done. If you are in the habit of praying with somebody, you can also hear in the way people are praying sometimes, because those are times of vulnerability that they might be asking God to take them, that they're, would you please take me soon? So you listen for some of those cues. We ask them about their eating behaviors and their sleeping behaviors, and those are also indicative of a depression. If somebody has stopped eating or is overeating, as it might be, if someone is struggling to sleep, because of some of those depression symptoms, but also when someone is planning something like this, a lot of those plans can happen in the middle of the night when they're alone, when it's really at your most vulnerable moment in the middle of the night. Would ask questions about, are they still enjoying things, about their work, about their school, about their hobbies, about activities and social interactions, and then pay attention to how they're presenting physically. So online, you could still get a sense of how somebody looks, although they could certainly present well for that moment, and that's just hard to tell. Now, if somebody is used to drinking, but you start seeing the alcohol intake going up, or they do recreational drugs, and now you see that becoming more use of that, an obsession, that also might be an indication that they're needing to actually cope with something bigger than what they have before. Another piece might be taking unnecessary risks. So someone might have this plan by, let's say, the end of September. If nothing gets better, then I'm going to act on my plan. And in this intervening period, because they've got this plan in place, you might see some risk-taking behavior, the way they're driving, the way they're walking along the edge of something too close to the edge of a bridge, for example. Those kind of things can actually come up as well. And we can ask that. Are you finding yourself taking more risks than usual? Or if you're in touch with a friend or a family member, to actually see that as a warning sign as well. The is path warm. Is path warm, ISPATHWARM, is path warm, is a mnemonic that we can actually remember about some of the warning signs. So the I stands for an ideation, that somebody actually has this habitual ideas of suicide. The S stands for substance abuse, that substances are becoming a bigger part of their life than before. The P stands for purposelessness. So, because they're not able to engage in the activities of life as they used to, this person has so much time and there's a bit of aimlessness or purposelessness. Often anxiety will go up before someone makes the plan. So the A of path stands for anxiety. The T is for trapped. And that's the whole idea when someone cannot solve a problem and they don't know how to get out of it, and they might express that they feel trapped. The H stands for hopelessness, a sense that there's no hope. The W of warm stands for withdrawal, so moving away into themselves. Sometimes there is anger for the A. The R is for recklessness, and that's what I spoke about earlier, some of that risk-taking behavior. And the M for mood changes. So is path warm is an acronym that you can have in your mind as you're thinking through questions. So let's look at what's at the bottom there of companioning in an acute situation. We've got ask, listen, assess, keep safe, connect to resources, companion, and self-care. So we're going to go through each of these in turn. So let's look at that next slide there. And it starts at the bottom there with ask. If you're starting to see some of those warning signs, be direct. You're not there. It is a myth that you can give somebody the idea. let's just put that out there. That's a myth. So you need to actually name it. I'm worried about you and I want to know. Have you been thinking about killing yourself? Now, it's a hard thing to say for the first time. Practice it. It sounds like a funny thing to say. Practice it in front of the mirror. If you are with another person who both of you are in the supportive role, practice it with each other. Looking at a human being in the eyes and saying, have you been thinking about killing yourself, is a hard thing to get to say for the first time. So do get into the practice of asking. My experience with asking is that if somebody wants help and you've asked, they will breathe a sigh of relief and begin to release their pain and begin to talk about it. If somebody has made a plan and it is a tight plan and they're not going to let anybody in, there is nothing we can do. And so we cannot prevent that suicide. We can still support the person. We can be aware. We can ask this question. But if somebody is not going to tell us and it's not a safe place, it's really, really hard. Having lost somebody to suicide, somebody really close, I think what's been a gift to me is to come to the place of respect. That if somebody wants to die, it's not actually my role to save them. We get into this medicalized way of thinking that we are about saving people's lives. We are about supporting people to make a good choice. I cannot save someone. And this is where that earlier theological perspective comes in. You know, if God has given human beings freedom, we need to give some of that to each other. Now, we love each other, right? And we want to protect each other. And we will do the best we can. And when we know that somebody is at this place, we may break the code and get somebody in there to save them. That's what we need to do. But if somebody is not letting on that this is where they are, there is nothing we can do. And we actually have to we have to surrender it. It's the only way for our own survival. And this is someone who struggles with codependency telling you this. It is very hard. It's very hard. So once we've asked the questions, as Sarah was saying, the next thing we do is listen. And this is very hard to listen without giving advice, because boy, do we want to come up with the how-tos at this point. But the aim of the listening here is that the person can release their pain and actually fight their hopelessness in self-talk. So there is a human instinct that doesn't want to die. There was some research done at the San Francisco Bridge many years ago, maybe about 15 years ago, and a gentleman wrote a book about it. He interviewed people who had jumped and who had survived. And he asked them about what it was like on the way down. And many of those folks said, I was rehearsing, I hope this doesn't work. Why did I do it? I want to live. So there's a human instinct towards living, particularly in that moment when they have started the dying process. So when you are asking someone the question and finally they get to release their pain, sometimes that self-talk can come out where they begin to actually talk hope back into themselves. And so what you're listening for when you're listening is you're listening for their emotion. You're letting them vent that emotion and get it out. You're prompting them for details to see if they actually do have a plan. So get a sense of how much they have got to. But you're also listening for reasons for living. And as they begin to self-talk those out, you know what it's like when we're in that space, when someone's asked and you say, oh, and I'm thinking about doing this, but I was also wondering about this, this, and this. And that's what you're listening to. You're listening for their own ambivalence, their own back and forwardness. And you're reflecting back to them any hopeful reasons for living that might be coming out at that point. So you're not giving advice. You're actually supporting their own advice to themselves at that point. Okay, so that's that active listening phase that we're talking about at this point. If we could change slides, I'm going to show you now a risk assessment. So when you're listening, there's a couple of things that we can do here, and I can certainly remind me to send this out. Maybe, Beth, you can write a list of things that I promised to send to you, and then I'll do it. It was worked through by Sanctuary as something that could be used by someone who might not be trained as a mental health professional, but can still do a risk assessment because it helps us to understand the kind of action that we may want to take. So when we assess the level of risk, we're asking them about their pain. Now, sometimes we can get a sense of it, but often I like to ask someone to rate their pain. Like, what is that internal pain on a scale of 1 to 10? Where would you put it? Has it been this bad before? What did you do with it? Or is this just the worst that it's been? And so you get a sense of level where their pain is. Then you get a sense of where their plan is. And some of this we've talked about, the idea, thought, habitual thought, and plan. The plan is that in a low risk is that the person has no specific plan and they're not really sure about their desire to die. In a medium risk, it is planned to a higher degree, but it's not an immediate risk. They may not have set the date, they may not have purchased the means, but they know what they would do if they were to do it. That's where they are at a medium risk. And then at a high risk, it's planned fully. So they've got the means, it's prepared, they've got the date, they've got the time. And then the next level is the means. So low risk, there's no means available. Medium, maybe yes, maybe no. So they may have this high level plan and there might be some things they could use in their home, but they haven't really sort of collected it in a place to use it yet. And high risk is that the means have been purchased and they're good to go with it. So there's different actions that we would do based on what we have assessed at this point. In the action required under a low risk is to validate and focus on the strengths and the personal resources that they do have. And we'll talk about a safety plan in just a moment and get a sense of what this person has around them. And by strengths, you're listening to that ambivalent voice when they're sharing their pain, how much they want to die, how much they want to live, and reinforcing their hopes of that. You're also listening to the things that they may want to live for, that they want to offer and contribute to the world and they want to give. So those are some of their strengths. Their personal resources are some of the courage that they've had in the past, maybe to overcome some things. You're also getting a sense of how they've coped with difficult times in the past. So do they rely on some spiritual practices that they have? Are they part of a community that they go to? Do they have good friends around them that they would talk to? Can they speak to somebody about this? What do they do when they're in crisis before? Do they have an exercise pattern that they use? Do they journal? So do they have some ways that they actually deal with their overwhelming emotions? Those would be their personal resources. And you then, if they haven't been able to to name some of them, ask some questions, and again with the safety plan that we will take you through that. And then you can identify some supports and resources with them and leave them with some phone numbers. And in the safety plan, there's a place to do that as well. Have a concrete goal so that what are you going to do when you leave here? What's this week going to look like for you? And then identify another meeting. Now, if you are someone who, again, if you're online with this and you're not there, you will, in the course of the conversation, whether they're low, medium, or high risk, identify people in their circle who they can tell this to. And I am usually pretty firm about this. I say, I can't carry this alone, and we need to talk to somebody. Who would you like me to talk to? Or who can you talk to? Who can we do this? How can we do this together? If you're on location with the person, I would say, who can we phone now? And I begin to connect them immediately. If you're online, maybe Sarah can talk about this when we do the online piece. But I do think it's really important that you are not the only person who knows that this is going on for someone. But we do our best to get the permission of the person to share. If the person is adamant that they don't want to give another person, then I say, I'm going to choose somebody to talk to for you, unless you come up with somebody. I do this because partly it's our legal responsibility to do this, but it's tricky because having had this very vulnerable, tender conversation, suicidal thoughts and plans are shameful, and it's hard that somebody's just shared them and now you're going to ask them to share them again. But that's the route we take, and they can choose somebody. They can certainly choose someone. Okay, medium risk. The thing that would change under medium risk is that you begin to identify their supports and the specific resources straight away. You go to a suicide plan, and I would make a no harm agreement with this person. Sometimes that can be in writing. You can develop one for generous space. It really is somebody just saying that this is what they're declaring. They can sign it, they can email you it, whatever a way that you can actually, a person is doing something that they can commit to. Sometimes eliciting a promise might be as far as you can go with somebody. Promise me that you'll be there for our next meeting. And sometimes that verbal vow is what somebody needs to hold them through yet another day, another week, or however long that might be. And again, you're going to be widening the circle. So you're not going to be carrying this on alone. When someone moves for high risk, you're taking them to the hospital and you're phoning 911. So you escorting them. You're not going to leave them alone if you're with them. If you're on a webinar with them or using social media with somebody or on the phone with somebody, you get somebody else who's with you to call 911 and go pick them up. Like, this is emergency, and you treat it as if somebody is just having a heart attack and you need to get them to medical care. It's that urgent. So that's what you do for high risk. Okay. So I'm being very honest here. So we're going straight in, and I might be saying some things that are difficult, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine myself doing this. Again, these are the kind of things that you may want to go over together with your teams and become more and more comfortable. In workshops, we actually role play some of this so that you can just get a sense of what that could actually feel like as a human-to-human conversation. And as Sarah said, we don't have checklists, but at certain points, the alarm bells are going off, and you need to then follow a little bit of a protocol for yourself. So let's talk a little bit about keeping safe. This keeping safe is when someone is medium to high risk. And so they have some kind of a plan. And so you are going to talk them through removing their planned suicide methods. My preference here is actually to do it with somebody else who lives with them, or to have, if you can't go to their home, or you'd have somebody else go with them, so that they are identifying some of the things that they have done. Now, bearing in mind that if somebody has come to a place where they have planned this and they don't want to fail, they may not let you into this. So if somebody lets you into this, they want to live. You know, there is a real desire here, and you are walking on sacred ground. They are taking you into some of the most vulnerable parts of what they were thinking of doing. This is sacred ground. You are being Christ to them, as if you could imagine Christ shining a light into the darkest areas. This is what you're doing. And so you're going to ensure the person is safe according to their suicide risk, that they can take care of themselves, that if they can't, that they're going to go and stay with a family member or a friend, or else if it's high risk, they're going to hospital or to 24-hour watch, and that they will meet with a clinician, that they've actually set something up for that to happen, and that they're going to stay sober. So when I've done under a medium risk, when I've elicited a promise, or I have got them to have some kind of agreement with me, these are the things that would need to be stated in that agreement. That I want to live. I'm going to try to live. I'm going to remove my planned suicide methods. If I can't take care of myself, that I'm going to go to be with family, friends, or to the hospital, that I plan to meet with my clinician, and I promise that I will not use alcohol or drugs while I'm in this emotional state. It moves the risk up if somebody then moves into a state where they are no longer allowing their fully aware conscious mind to actually assist them to deconstruct a plan and actually manage their emotions. So that's why the staying sober is important. And Beth, write this down. I can send you an example of what a safety plan contract looks like, so that you guys can work one that works best with your culture of generous spaces. So a safety plan is different from keeping safe. So keeping safe is when someone's at that really medium high risk, and they are keeping safe from their plan. Really, they dismantling their plan. A safety plan is actually a road to recovery, and it starts with ways that somebody can manage their own emotion. And I've called it self-soothing here. Now, I know self-soothing comes up in other conversations around perhaps pornography and other kind of conversations that we might have. You know, at this point, self-soothing is something that can really save somebody if they're on their own, and the suicidal habitual thoughts and plan is so overwhelming that they don't know what they can do. And so they find something, and here's another acronym for you, that is I'll say it first and then I'll give you the acronym, is a short-term emotional releasing behavior, a STERB, STERB, a short-term emotional releasing behavior. And that's the self-soothing stuff. So, you know, if you're one of these heavy metal people and you need to stick that music on and you just need to like jam away and get that emotion out of you, you do it, right? Reading is not a STERB. It's certainly not. Sometimes looking at erotic material could be, let's just say. There can be some self-care things that could be emotionally releasing things. A hard run could be a STERB. Actually, online interactions is actually considered a STERB as well. So it is, if you know that kind of adrenaline stuff that happens when you're like posting stuff and seeing if people respond, and it's just kind of this really emotive moment. Those are short-term emotional releasing behaviors. Now, those are adequate, especially when somebody is in medium and high risk. but we want to move away from them. We want people to have some healthy self-soothing ways, and these will then turn into emotional management, and that might lead to, when I'm emotional like this, what do I do? Maybe I journal, maybe I say a prayer, maybe I go for a walk, maybe I have a hot bath with a candle, maybe there's a book that I turn to, maybe there's a poem that helps me at these moments. So the short-term high emotional releasing can shift into some practices to actually learn to manage emotion. And that's where we'd hope somebody would move in their recovery process. But if they're not working, so you're experiencing high emotional overwhelm and they're not working at this point, you may then want to encourage somebody to list some friends and some phone numbers where those are folks who, first of all, they know that this person is in a struggle, and they're willing to be a lifeline for somebody. Then they can make a call. And sometimes a phone call might be enough, because speaking it through is a way to actually lower some of that emotion and kind of let that valve of that emotion come out. If the phone call is not enough, the person may need to be present with somebody, and that's when they would move to be with a family member or friend. And then it might become high risk at that point. If that's still not assisting somebody, you would then take them to the professional. So a safety plan like this kind of lists some of those things out, and you would move your way down them. And that's how that functions. Before we take questions here, I want to speak about what it means for us when we're engaging someone. Now, as we've gone through this material of listening, asking those hard questions, listening, assessing somebody, asking the hard questions, and you are now hearing such intense information. So you are going to need to do something with that. I don't get permission from this person to debrief. I always debrief with somebody. And in Sanctuary, when I had been involved with something like this at a community, there would be somebody that I would have a phone conversation afterwards. Often we would go in twos with the coach and would go out for coffee afterwards and just talk it through. So you don't need to reveal who it is for a debrief. So if you feel like you need to keep confidence, you can phone somebody and say, I've just had a really difficult conversation and I need to talk about it. Change the name and spill it out. Tell people what's gone on for you, what it looked like, what was said that is most sticking for you. Sometimes there's one word, an image, and you just can't, you can't get it out of your head. Talk it out with somebody so that you're not holding that alone. It's really important that you pay attention to you, because if you don't, those things become obsession. And then as a carer, we can actually become addicted to those moments. And when we're addicted to saving other people, you'll end up being like me and struggling with codependence. And what that means is that you actually stop taking care of yourself. That every time you need to pay attention to your own emotion and your own struggles, you want to then rescue somebody else. And that's the codependence addiction. So it's really important to pay attention to you in these moments. And we manage our fear by admitting that this is a fearful place to be. And maybe you know that you're going on to a call with somebody and you're really afraid. Talk about it and say you're really afraid. The reptilian brain inside of us goes to fight or flight. And so what happens when fear is driving us is that we can really want to rescue the person as our way of fighting this thing, and we don't really have a respectful distance, or we run away and we just can't be fully present in our brain. We check out in one way or another. So to be aware of that fear. And a couple of points remaining there is to balancing care and respect is something that I like to talk about here, because we think that in these moments it's all about care. And care is when we're actually reaching out to this person. Respect is when we step back and realize that they have their own human freedom and their own human choice, and that the recovery process starts when the person who has been suicidal and maybe extremely suicidal begins to take their own path toward recovery. And that was the definition that Sarah shared with us. It is a self-determined path. And so the image that I hold in my mind with this, so if you imagine somebody at the bottom of a pit, and they're in the depths at this point. They are considering to die because things have got so unmanageable. And you are standing at the top of the pit. There are a number of things you could do. If you decided that you were just going to be caring without respect, you may tie your foot to a tree and lower your own body down and grab hold of that person and hoist them up. They have no choice at that point. You may only respect them, and that is that you stand at the top of the pit with your arms folded and you say, all right, come on, climb up. You can do it. The balance of care and respect, and I don't know how best to do it other than this picture, is instead of using the rope to tie your foot to a tree, you actually lower the rope and you say, I'm here and I can pull you up, but you need to take hold of that end. I can't do that for you. So there is help, but the person needs to needs to make some choices and actions as well. And so this is a bit of a dance that we go through between care and respect. The last words there before we open for a time of questions, and I realize we're running a little bit out of time here, but is that letting go is not about letting go of the rope at the top. Letting go is actually about letting go our sense of responsibility for the outcome. Now, in a little book that on Christian community that I'm stalling because I just can't remember his name.
Souls in the Hand of a Tender God.
It might be.
Yeah,
Craig Renebaum. Craig, thank you, Sarah. Craig Renebaum writes that one way to help with this is to have some kind of a mantra where we can pray or say something regular that will help us put a boundary between the person and ourselves, even symbolically. And it could be, I put you between so-and-so and myself. So there is a visual or a word or something that we do that moves us one step back. And we can do this even verbally when we're having the debrief with somebody. Let's pause here.
Yes, we have had a few questions. First of all, just thank you. There's been so much good information here. I'm learning a lot. Just around this online question. So if we are interacting with someone online, is it a good idea to have this conversation by phone with them, to have this conversation in sort of a Skype face-to-face type of a scenario, or is it okay to have that by text when it's this kind of a conversation?
I think it really depends on the context and how well you might know them. So if it's somebody that you regularly chat to online, it might be worthwhile trying to connect with them by phone so you can hear their voice. But sometimes I would imagine that you're in a situation where you may have never really talked to someone before and they are opening up to you, or they're venting, or they're just talking about this. And in that case, the most important thing is to stay connected with them. And so, especially if you're not in the same city or there's long distance charges or whatever, I think the best thing is to try and invite another moderator or another person to be part of that conversation with you, so that you're not just carrying it yourself, and that you have a witness there to help you and support you. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Yeah. Thanks. Another question, just when you talked, Sharon, about bringing someone else or asking the person who else they would like to tell, to have someone as part of that. Someone was asking about how, not everyone is receiving the training that we're receiving, and maybe especially if it's a loved one that they want to tell, they might be very afraid in the midst of that. That person might not respond super helpfully. Is it a good idea to ask them instead to talk to someone on a crisis line or a family doctor, or someone who might have some more experience with this? Or what's the distinction there for you?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say that if they have a trusted other who knows some of their journey and it's not going to be a complete surprise, that's probably the person to go to, and then they can accompany them to a health professional. If they're in a situation where if they're going to start talking about this, that it's brand new, perhaps going to a crisis line is preferable. I mean, just hearing Sarah's response also to online, the online conversation, I think there is certainly a grading that happens for someone sharing this. It is easier to share with an anonymous person and easier to share perhaps with a professional person, and then it gets gradually harder when relationships are. So you're going to want to slowly move people in the direction where they're letting somebody more deeply in, but it's going to be harder and harder as they move along that path. So if they are online with you, possibly the next step would be a crisis line if you think about moving in that line, in that direction. But then it would be to a voice, and it's someone who doesn't know them. It's a trained person, so that's good. And then they would probably coach them to say, is there anyone else that you can let in? So they would be doing the same thing. They would be then coaching them to the next person, who would then be somebody who potentially knows them, who lives with them, and gradually they would then open that up. And again, you would be going from an online anonymous to maybe a voice on a phone to then an in-person face-to-face, which is actually probably the harder disclosure. So I think that would that make sense to you, Sarah?
Yeah, and I'm just going to speak from my personal experience here. So 2 summers ago, I was having a really tough time, and I needed to talk to someone, and I was suicidal. And what I did is I didn't tell my husband, who was home at the time. I asked him to watch out for our daughter, and I called a crisis line. And the reason I did that was because I knew that I needed to get some language around what was happening to me to someone that I didn't know, who didn't have a stake in the outcome. I'm going to say that again. Sometimes people who love us, we need to be able to articulate what we're feeling without really freaking them out. And the ironic thing, it was very humbling for me because I had walked other people through suicidal attempts and process and all of that, and I had never called a crisis line myself, but I did, and it was so helpful because I got some space. I could talk to someone who didn't know me, but who was a voice on the other end of the phone, talking me down, writing a safety plan with me, which I then put on my fridge. And then I was able to say to my husband, hey, let's talk about this. Like, I'm really having a tough time. Here's what I've got, right? So it can actually be safety. You're actually encouraging people to connect with family and friends. But I actually don't think for anybody, even a mental health coach, right, or a professional or somebody who's helped other people through, a crisis line is never a bad idea. To just kind of get that initial, okay,
Yeah. Just while we're on the topic of crisis lines, a question came up about, there's a fear sometimes that people have when they connect with a crisis line that there will be police that will be called and that other steps will be taken that maybe they don't want to take. How realistic is that? How can you coach people through those kinds of fears, and what happens with the crisis line?
Well, the crisis line is anonymous, and there is no technology. Unless you give them your address, they can't actually, do anything about it. And because they're usually volunteers and they have certain standards, their job is not to intervene in that way. They will encourage you to call 911 if they feel it's necessary. The only other way that, so I think it's a safe space for somebody who needs to talk to someone about what's going on for them. It definitely was for me. The other thing, though, to be aware of is that, especially if you're in a different city or you're not able to get to someone, you can actually call the local police and they will do a wellness check. So it's actually called a wellness check. I know because I've done it for someone in Ontario when I was in Vancouver. And you ask that person's permission first. And then you say, I'm calling someone to come and check on you. And the police will actually go and check on them and then take it from there. So if by the time they get there, that person is needing to be taken to the hospital or whatever, they can deal with that as a first responder situation. But in terms of crisis lines, they generally don't send someone to your door unless you give them permission to do so.
We do have a participant saying that did happen to them at one point, that the police were called and it was tracked. And then also just a caution just for our folks that sometimes on crisis lines, they're not as trained around LGBT questions. So just that being a little sort of check that it might not be, as helpful in some cases, but
thanks for the clarification. I mean, it's not the same for every crisis line. And
right.
I hope that situation was a helpful one and not a traumatic one.
Just sticking with the crisis situation, the very high risk, and that balance you were talking about, Sharon, with respect and care. So is it disrespectful then to force someone or to, call, you were talking about permission, Sarah, to have the police come, but if they're in that very high risk situation, making that call, sending the police there, is that something that's then violating their respect, or is that something that we should do to care for them? That's a tough one, probably.
It's a very hard one. And I think that in a medium to high risk situation, it's better to lose a friend than to lose someone to suicide. So I would then move fully into care mode at that point and make the call. And you may have to repair the relationship. And that's happened to me, where I've had to repair a relationship around that. But that's the call that I make. The best option is when you can. So best case scenario, you are caring and you are inviting someone and they are choosing well. Let's go back to that. We are supporting somebody to choose well. If you're in a place where you're supporting someone and in front of you or with you, they are choosing poorly, then it becomes an extreme risk. I'm going to take action on their behalf.
Thanks for that. Do you know of any other organizations besides police that would do a wellness check like that? Are there mental health organizations you can call instead?
I can only speak for British Columbia. So there is a BC-wide service called SAFER. All these acronyms, we just love them in my field. Suicide awareness and suicide awareness, FER. And keep going. Okay. Yeah. So that's a good one. And actually, Beth, write this down. Sanctuary's actually got a resource list that we can send to you. And
that's wonderful.
Think a lot of BC oriented ones, but you'd need to look. I just see the Canadian Mental Health Association popping up there. Mm-hmm. They're in every province and in most cities. So SAFER stands for Suicide Attempt Follow-up, Education, and Research. So they will follow up not only for an individual, but for their families as well. So if you have experienced a traumatic event as a family member, walking the road, companioning with somebody, SAFER provides that as well.
That's good to know. Yeah, and something maybe we can be researching in our own location, since I know a lot of people tuning in are from Eastern Canada and Central Canada.
Okay.
I just want to bless you to keep going. I know we might go a little over time, and for those who are tuning in where it's 10 p.m., 11 p.m., if you need to sign off at any point, feel free. We are recording this, so we can send you a link and you can watch the end. But I think it would be great for you to continue with your material, even if we're a little bit over time, Sharon. and Sarah.
Okay. I need to take a deep breath. I think probably everybody does. So just put your feet on the floor, lift your shoulders really high, and then just let it all go. Ooh, feels better already. This is not easy material. I know even as Sharon was talking, it was bringing up experiences and situations for me, and I was remembering things, and it's sort of building all up here, and I need to just let it go. So I just want to acknowledge that Sharon has actually really touched on a lot of this material already. So I'm going to try to just narrow in on it and really, really build that foundation for you. So she's talked about that acute moment, right? When someone is really about to attempt or in the high risk situation. But there is also this idea that I have dealt with personally and supported people through of suicidality. So this idea that it's a pattern. We don't often think about it that way, but it's definitely a thing. That doesn't sound very academic, but what I mean to say is there can be a loop that people get into, and it's very tied to depression, especially long-term depression. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to deal with that, because it is separate from that sort of, if you think about that immediate, oh, you need help right now, like we need to get on this. This is an emergency first responder, immediate kind of situation versus, which I can imagine happening all the time, people on the chat or online who tend to talk about not wanting to live all the time, or maybe live in that space more, or express their thoughts on the matter as a matter of routine, like that's what they do often. So we're going to get into that, and just down here there's kind of a summary of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a little bit about boundaries, some circles of care, this idea of the Karpman triangle, and how venting and your roles online really work. And again, something that Sharon has really excellently touched on already, which is rescuing versus supportive relationships. So I think this is really key, and actually I'm probably going to spend most of my time here. This idea of circles of care. And I'm just going to tell you a little story. So it was 4 a.m. I was staying with a friend. I was very pregnant and tired and nauseous. And I got a call from a hospital saying that someone I had been supporting and cared for was at the emergency and was going to get discharged to a shelter. And I was in no position to be there because they were in another city at that point. And that was really hard for me. But the amazing thing about that was because I had journeyed with that person and set up some support systems, I actually said to the social worker who called me, I'm going to call you right back. I phoned a friend who was also part of this person's circle of care, and they were free. And they were able to go to the hospital. And they were able to be there in that moment when I couldn't. Now, I was that person's emergency contact. But if you just think about this picture, anybody that you're supporting should have more than one emergency contact, okay? So if you are the only person that person is connecting with on a regular basis, that's not a long-term sustainable thing that you can't actually help them. And the more that they only connect with you, the less likely you will be able to help them. So a circle of care is, there's quite a few different ones. You know, there's professional help, right? There's medical, there's psychiatrists and all of that. There's friends, there's family, and then there's institutions. So that could be church, it could be generous spaces, it could be the local community center. Anywhere that they connect in a community setting that is there to help them, or that they, build their community with. It could even be work, or it's just like that institutional place that they often go and receive support. And then there's family, there's friends, and then there's the professional medical side. So what you want to be doing, again, that you see this at the bottom of the slide, is that circle should be getting ever wider. So if, and this is especially important, if somebody is dealing with long-term depression and continued or repeated suicide attempts. Again, I'm going to speak from my own experience. After the fourth time that I brought someone to the hospital, I couldn't do it by myself anymore. And that put me in a very difficult position, because obviously they were suffering and they were in crisis and they needed people, and I was burning out. And so I just want us to think about, every time you connect with somebody who's in crisis, especially around this kind of long-term repeated suicidal kind of behavior or depression, the idea is that you're always bringing another person alongside. So you're widening their circle. So you're asking questions like Sharon said, who's with you right now? Who do you feel comfortable to talk to? Is there someone that you like spending time with who could help you? This is really key. I can't really stress this enough. And so in this particular case, what had happened is I burned out. And my friend had the good idea that everybody who is connected to this person got together for a meeting and said, here's what I can do. Here's my availability. Here's what I can't do. Here's my role. And we met together and we worked that out. And then after that, that was the beginning of their road to recovery, because it meant that they had, I think, 3 more attempts at suicide and had to be hospitalized for their own safety. It meant that there was a whole team of people who had all been concerned about this person, but hadn't actually talked to each other and hadn't actually come up with a plan. Mm-hmm. And so by me reaching out and getting that meeting together, I was widening that circle of care. And even now, I'm still in relationship with this person. I love them dearly. And there are times when they call me in the middle of the night and I can be there for them because I have a baby who I nurse. But there are other times when they call me and I just text them and say, hey man, can you see if so-and-so is available? And I know that that person might be, because we've created that circle of care. So that's kind of what I'm going to say about that. I'm just going to pull up my notes here. Sharon, did you want to add anything at this point? Are you okay?
Yeah, great.
Okay. All right.
Oh, one thing I was just wondering, Sarah, and maybe you can speak to this, is just the balance between when you are supporting somebody and you realize that you've come to the end of what you can do and the person needs to see a professional around this particular moment. What would you do around knowing your own boundaries and when you can say, okay, I can't do this anymore?
Yeah.
It comes down to this idea of rescuing versus helping and supporting. So it's really easy to drive someone to a doctor's appointment, even if you're not a doctor, right? It's also easy to help someone book an appointment, even if you can't go with them. It's easy to do some research and say, hey, here's some phone numbers for some great psychiatrists that are recommended. There's lots of steps you can take that allow you to take a step back and say, I'm not a doctor. I can't actually help you in this way anymore, but here are some ways I can still help you, right? So that's kind of where, but again, I mean, this is a common struggle with so many kinds of mental illness. And even for me, it took me 2 years to see a psychiatrist. And at that time, I was already a mental health coach. So people have their own threshold of where they get to, where they feel like they can reach out for professional care. And you cannot push that. Like, that is up to them. But you can offer them those resources, and you can be available to say, I'm happy to come with you. I'm happy to wait for you. I'm happy to make the phone call, that kind of stuff. So, yeah. All right. So this is just to give you a bit of background, because I think this is helpful not just in this relationship, but in all of our relationships. And that is, this is something called the Cartman triangle. And it's this idea that no matter what role we occupy in relationship, we need to be aware of that role, and we need to understand whether it's healthy or unhealthy. And so in the triangle idea, I know it's not a triangle here, but there's 3 trees. They don't look very healthy, and they're all intertwined, so you still get the picture. There's a victim, an oppressor, and a rescuer. And I think for the purpose of this discussion, we just need to really focus in on the rescuer, because I know that we're getting low on time here. So as Sharon already said, rescuing makes you feel good. It doesn't help the person. In fact, the more you rescue someone, the more you keep them in a victim role. And so I'm going to say that again. When we act out of fear or anger, it feels really good. It feels good to act, and it feels good to feel like we're doing something. But it actually does nothing for the other person. We need to act out of a place of peace and take a step back and say, I can't save you, but I can walk beside you. I can be present for you. And so this Cartman triangle basically said that in all relationships, we can occupy each of these roles, and we need to really be aware of whether we're doing that or not. And as soon as you are aware of that, you can actually step off the triangle. You can say, oh, I'm rescuing right now. This is not helping. If I'm the rescuer, you're the victim. Nobody's going anywhere here. We're just locked in this relational in this dynamic that is unhealthy, and I need to step out of that. And there's a lot of research you can do around this and really get into it. It's really interesting and cool stuff. I love psychology and thinking about the ways people relate to one another. But again, the important thing here is that recovery is self-directed. And until you break out of these roles, me as rescuer, you as victim, there's no movement forward. We're just going we're going like this, as opposed to there's forward movement where people actually begin to do some recovery and change.
I was just going to say that if you have had played the role of rescuer when someone is at a high risk moment, you may want to once say this person had an attempt and then they moved to hospital and begin their recovery. That's a moment you actually may want to have a conversation around redefining the dynamic, because you actually put yourself in rescuer correctly, I would say, in a rescuer mode. But for the health of this person, you need to step away from that. And that's tough. It's really a hard moment, but the conversation will certainly benefit both of you in the long run.
And the reason I was really thinking about this, especially in the context of online, is that we really play these roles. And it's easy to play them, especially when you're anonymous, right? But for example, if I keep rescuing someone, and I have kept rescuing someone, actually, let me just take a moment here. All right, so I was in the hospital visiting someone that I had helped commit. And they were now being cared for by a psychiatrist, by nurses. They had a counselor, they had medication. They were doing really well. And all I kept talking about when I was there visiting them was their doctors or psychiatrists, their medication, blah, blah, blah. And I realized I had nothing to say about that. All I was doing was rehashing what other people were now carrying. And I actually realized the best thing I could do in that moment was just ask them how their day was going, or talk about something that wasn't medication, hospital, mental health, suicide, all of that. Mm-hmm. They actually had all that stuff covered now. I didn't need to rescue them anymore. I had done my part by bringing them to the hospital, making sure they were committed, making sure that they were there and safe. And now my job was actually to step out of that rescuer role and say, I'm going to be your friend. You need a friend. You've got all this other stuff covered now. And that was a turning point because I actually asked for their opinion about something, not just me giving them my opinion. And we began to rebuild our mutual relationship where they actually got to have input in my life as opposed to me just being another voice of telling them what they needed to do. So I'm going to just wrap this up here in a way. And I want to talk about online venting, but I just want to say, if you can think about, instead of being a rescuer, can you be a coach? So the key difference between a rescuer and a coach is that the coach sees that person as capable of making choices and solving their own problems. And you, as a coach, you ask questions that enable that person to see the possibilities for positive action and to focus on what they want. So when you're rescuing, you're making decisions for them. And when you're coaching, you're asking them to think about what they want to do. And of course, this is all, I just want to say this is all in the context of a long-term caring relationship where somebody is experiencing long-term depression and maybe more than one suicide attempt, or maybe habitual suicidal thoughts. Obviously, if you're in that situation and it's a crisis moment, please rescue them. And then step back and think about the long-term recovery. And it's complex, there's no easy answers here. And you're going to step in and out of this role, and you're going to be aware of it and then not aware of it, and then you're going to feel overwhelmed and wonder why, and then you're going to realize that you've become involved in this dynamic. So I'm just going to move on to this because I think that this is something that you guys probably struggle with, and it asked for us to talk about. And that is the idea of venting. So there's a question here, and that is it helpful? And the answer is yes and no. And so there's a lot of research out here to show that certain kinds of venting are helpful depending on what you're feeling. So anger and venting, all that does is fuel your anger. It's been proven that the more angry you are and the more you vent about that, the more angry you will be, and the more that will continue the cycle, and actually then other people will get angry. However, this is the research done by Dr. Jeffrey Lohr. Sadness and depression are improved by expressing your feelings, getting them validated, and then getting them fixed. Now, I don't like that language of fixed, but that's his language. But here's the really key question, and that is maybe something for Generous Spaces to think about, is how can you break out of a cycle of venting and into real life support and help? And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with your community, your online community, where people feel safe to share how they're feeling in a space where they feel it's okay. I mean, I'm part of a mom's group called, actually I won't tell you what it's called, and people just, the rules are you can't give advice, and you can't betray anonymity, and all you can do is say, man, that really sucks. And so there's been times where I've been having a tough time and I just write it. And it makes me feel better. Because chances are there's about 30 other comments of people going, man, I so hear you. I had the same day. And that's all it's for. And it helps me feel like I'm part of a community of people who understand it. It basically is telling me I'm not alone. My struggles are not my own, and I'm not alone. But here's the key. So here's the thing. Venting is okay because, as research has shown, it does improve your feelings. And you get them validated. You say, okay, I'm not alone. Many people feel like this. But here's the important part. You then move to real life support and help. So I just want you to think for a minute, as a moderator or as a support person, are there people in your groups who are continually in this space without seeming to move forward? Are there people who actually need some real life support and help? Are there ways you can encourage them to do that? And then that comes back to, in this context, our conversation about safety plans, crisis lines, professional care, all of that comes into the picture. Those are things you can actually start to put in place. I mean, a really simple question to ask someone, especially in an online or over the phone context, is there anybody with you right now? Do you feel safe to talk to them? So, you know, the crisis line I called, they asked me, are you home alone? Is there someone there that you can talk to? And even a simple question like that can actually get people to stop thinking about this online context as the only place that they can talk about their feelings, and actually start to look outward to people that then can become part of their circle of care in real life. Yeah, so I think I've covered that fairly thoroughly. And then again, you know, we've talked about this. Sometimes we don't ask these hard questions. We're just locked in this pattern. And the really easy thing to ask yourself about a boundary, if you feel like there are no boundaries, is, does this feel right? Or am I qualified for this? Or does this fit with my skills, my compassion, or my time available? And if you're not answering those questions in a positive way, that's a really red flag. There's a boundary being crossed here, and you actually have to address that. But again, if you notice, all of these questions are about you. They're not about the other person. What they're doing is actually none of your business. The idea when you're setting up boundaries and you're working in an online space or in person is you're making sure that you are a safe person and that you are respecting, as Sharon said, yourself. And so if you can honestly assess where you're at and if your boundaries are getting pushed, that's a really good place to start. And you can probably fairly easily say, you know what, this does not feel right. Say you're in a private chat with someone and things are getting dark and they're talking about suicide and you're feeling overwhelmed and you don't feel qualified. It is totally okay to try and make that circle wider. You don't have to save them. You have to support them, and you also need support. So ask yourself these questions and think about that, you know, those 3 trees. Like, are you playing the role of a rescuer? Even just saying that out loud to yourself, oh, I'm really rescuing right now. I mean, the person that I've walked with for a long time, we actually laugh about it now, because sometimes we'll be having a conversation and I'll get all rescue-y and they'll be like, no thanks, I'm good. Like, don't do that thing you do. And I'm like, oh, right, sorry, it's just a habit, right? So, yeah. And I'm just going to let Sharon.
I was just going to say, one telltale sign for me is when I'm starting to get angry. And that's when, as a rescuer, I actually move to being oppressor, because both are positions of power. And I actually have a friend who I rescued from a suicide attempt. And the moment that things changed is when I told her to F off one day. And she turned around to me and she said, I thought you were my friend. And I realized how I had switched, and because I was in this position of power, constantly being the rescuing one, when I came to the end of myself, I became angry as a way to actually try and push her away. And we had to have that conversation. And now we laugh about it. She always says, do you remember the time you told me to F off? I said, yes, I do. Anyway, Sarah, back to you.
Yeah.
Just a quick question on that. What's a good way to set a boundary that wouldn't make a person feel further isolated?
Something that's coming to mind for me is that if you have started to establish that community of care, that network of care, then because so there's things that happen with boundaries. One, we can wait so long that by the time we're just about burnt out, we start setting boundaries, and then we really isolate the person, because perhaps, as Sarah mentioned in her lived experience, we've been the sole connector for that person. if we've done our job well and we have multiply connected, we can actually talk about our limits. And somebody who is struggling with any kind of mental health crisis or issue over a long term understands the language of human limitation. And so if we begin to just be human together and say, you know, I'm actually reaching my limits right now, like, and not only because of this individual, but potentially about all of our life. Like, this is what's going on for me at home. This is what's going on for me at work. What about so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so who are also in the circle of care? So I think just not letting the person on their own, that would be my first go. Did you want to add something to that, Sarah?
Yeah, I'm quiet because this is a core question here. Right, this is a question that reflects pretty much everything we've been talking about. When do you rescue, and when do you step back, and how do you care for someone in a moment, a serious moment, but also do the right thing for both of you? And I really appreciate what Sharon said about setting boundaries early on. Sometimes you can't do that, but I would also really encourage you, especially in this context, to really think about the role that you play as a support person within generous space. Think about the big picture. And there's a couple ways you can set boundaries that are not actually directly in conflict. So this is not avoidance, but for example, if there's someone that's crossing your boundary or has singled you out as a person that they can share with, but it's becoming overwhelming, it might be that you change your schedule. And you know that somebody else will be there for them to talk to. So it's not that you say, I'm busy. It's that you say to another support coach, hey, can we switch shifts for a little while? I trust you. I'm just feeling overwhelmed because I'm always online at the same time as this other person, and I need some space to really, just pull back a little. There's no interaction with that person. You're not rejecting them. You're not saying anything to them. Actually, there's no direct conflict. You're just taking time for yourself. So there's little tweaks you can do where they still feel valued, but it's a trust thing. Because if you set a boundary and pull back, you trust that someone else is going to be there to help them. And then the other way that I really like setting boundaries, and this comes to the idea of vicarious trauma. So sometimes somebody will tell you something and it actually traumatizes you because it's overwhelming. And so you have to be very careful with that, is really start practicing good habits of checking in with yourself before you start supporting other people. So that sounds like a lot of work, but it can be 5 minutes, right? It can be 2 minutes. It can be, before this webinar, Sharon and I looked at each other and went, what do you need? How are you doing? Do you need a moment for yourself before you then become available to support? So there's little ways that you can set boundaries. And then in a moment of crisis, say somebody is talking to you and they are feeling suicidal and they're telling you about it and you're feeling overwhelmed, you can just take a moment to breathe. That's a boundary in the sense that you're actually reminding yourself that you have a physical body, that you have feelings and emotions, and that you're impacted by this. And you're actually creating a situation that is not an emergency. Because if you just say, I just need a minute, or I'm just going to take a breath. You don't say I need a minute, but say I'm going to take a breath. You're actually encouraging that person to take a breath as well. And then you're giving yourself a moment to just pause. So that's another small, boundary that you can set. Are there any more questions, Beth, around this?
Is this the last slide, Sarah?
Let's see. Yeah, this is.
Oh, great.
So
we're at 7:20 Pacific time. I know it's probably 10:20 or 11:20 for some of you out there, but maybe we can plan to wrap up at 7:30. If there are any questions, feel free to type them in. I think just from the generous space side, this has been really helpful in terms of helping us think through what our circles of care are, even within our organization, within how we support facilitators, but also whether facilitators can be using staff as part of the circle of care and what our boundaries are. So I think there's a lot of work we can do from here in helping to identify some of that. And I'm grateful for the conversations that you're starting among us. And one of the groups in Windsor just said this is a conversation that's very live for them right now, as somebody's been struggling with mental health and they're all feeling like they're part of that circle of care and they need to have these conversations. So yeah, thank you for all of that. I'm not seeing any questions popping up. So what I would love to do is just to see, oh, one more thing. Yes, so can you guys comment on just the guilt that can sometimes come when you pull out of that rescuer mode, or when you put up a boundary? Say, how do you deal with that guilt that you yourself feel?
Well, I'm part of a 12 steps group. That's what I do. So I think that guilt, it's a common experience, so to share it just alleviates that. And I mean, this is something to work through for yourself in counseling with a spiritual director. With me, I do with my sponsor and with my 12 steps group. And when that guilt becomes if it's so loaded, and we don't, when an emotion or a feeling is actually connected to a childhood trauma or a childhood thing, and you can't actually, it's fuzzy, you can't actually make head or tail of it. You try and engage it, but it doesn't go away. It starts to grow. That's the time when I think it's actually a pilot light for us, that there is some emotional work that we may have to do. And that I'd go and see a counselor, and I would work through my needs. Let me speak in I terms. My need to constantly be rescuing people has been because I didn't want to deal with my own stuff. And so the moment I started to deal with my own stuff, that need to rescue, the need to always be there, started to diminish, because it was an addiction. It was masking something that was really going on for me. So I think unresolved guilt that's growing and growing and not being resolved over a good sort of the normal spiritual practices we do to actually forgive ourselves, then we need to seek help, because potentially it's triggering something that we may need to work further on. And taking care of our own needs is something as Christians we don't do well, and it's time we did that well. Yeah.
And Sharon, in your own oh, sorry, Sarah, you were going to jump in too.
I was just going to say that I can tell that I need to get some support, or that I'm having an emotional issue that needs to be worked through, when I start to feel like everybody relies on me and it's up to me to fix everything. And it's interesting, because in a lot of the work that I've done, I notice when that starts to happen. And the irony of this is that this kind of guilt happens to people who are highly capable and highly caring. So we get a lot of praise and affirmation about who we are from the fact that we are reliable and we can be relied on and we get stuff done. And that people can always come to us with their problems. That actually feeds our self-esteem, and we get addicted to that. Now that sounds wild, because you think, but I think about other people all the time and I just want to help other people. But I know for me, a red flag is whenever I start to get angry or feel guilty that I'm not doing enough and that it's up to me to fix everything. Or oh man, like this thing happened again and I'm the person that's on call again. Like, here I am. Well, nobody else is good enough to do it. I guess I'm going to do it. And then, that sounds negative, but it actually feeds your ego. And that's what this whole Cartman triangle mapped out is that it feels good to rescue, because then you're not focused on yourself, you're focused on someone else. And so I have a lot of compassion for guilt, because I experience a lot of it. And I know that it's really, really hard to walk away from someone in need. And I think one of the ways that I let that go is I trust that I'm actually not the only person who can help them.
Yeah.
And I tell myself that. And I build circles of care and ask for support so that I know I'm not the only person who can help them.
That's
So,
very relatable. Thanks, Sarah and Sharon. So I know you have a closing prayer that you'd like to do with us. I think we're going to cut it off here, just so that we have time for that. But I also just want to give a couple people a chance to maybe do a 30-second, I'll turn your video on if you just comment if you want to be one of these people, just to say something that you appreciated about this teaching, just so that Sharon and Sarah can see a couple other faces of people who've been involved. So just comment in the bar if you want to be one of those people, to take 20 to 30 seconds just to say thanks and one thing that you appreciated. I will say that I feel like you've set the bar really high for us as we now seek to do more webinars. This has been so informative and helpful, and I'm just really grateful that you've shared from your own stories as well. That personalized sort of touch has been, for me at least, a very encouraging piece to know that there's other people who feel this way, there's other people who have gone through this. I feel like it's really, broadened my, like, it makes me feel like in a very distant way you're part of my circle of care today. Just as people who feel that guilt and who don't know what to do sometimes in the midst of some of these situations. So is there anyone else who would like to you don't have to do video, I can just turn your audio on if you want to say a quick thing, or you can turn your own audio on actually, I believe. So please feel free to do that just in the next couple minutes here, and then we'll close.
Thank you, Sharon and Sarah. This is Paul and Linda Appler from the Windsor Group. And we did really appreciate it. It was very informative, and I think it's thought-provoking. And I know that we're going to take some time to digest. And I know my wife was very busy taking notes the whole time. So we're going to be able to go over it after this. Again, thank you so much for putting this together and
Thanks,
delivering.
Paul and Linda.
A really amazing resource, and I was taking pictures of the slides until you said you're going to be taping this, so then I stopped taking pictures.
Good.
A lot of information to digest.
Yeah. Anybody else want to quickly say a quick thanks?
This is Wendy here, and I just want to particularly honor the wisdom that you've brought in the ways that we need to integrate so many different aspects of our own journeys with the incredible privilege it is to walk alongside people. It takes incredible self-awareness and attunement to our ego need and ego strength, and I think by your vulnerability and sharing your stories, you've really highlighted how much this is part and parcel of our own journeys of commitment to recovery and commitment to wellness. And I think that is both inspiring and encouraging, and offers a challenge for all of us who seek to be supportive people. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Wendy.
My name's Ashley. Can you guys, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear.
So I wanted to say thanks. I facilitate the online group, and it's definitely a place where we have a lot of that recurring, people who have like a recurring struggle with mental illness and suicidality. So these ideas of expanding the circle and coming alongside people but not rescuing them, I think it's going to be really helpful for everyone in that group as we kind of co-support each other. So I'm very grateful, and definitely for both of you sharing your own experiences as well. Thanks.
Chad and Bill here from Windsor. Thank you very much. We have a lot to learn, and as facilitators in this small city, it's good to have resources like you guys. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Chad and Bill. Okay, I think I'm going to cut that off as well. Thanks so much for the folks who've spoken up. Sharon and Sarah, if you want to close us, we'd welcome that.
Okay. So Sharon and I were joking that we're going to make you all Anglicans. We're not. But oftentimes in the Anglican tradition, every night you say a prayer before you go to bed. And I really like this particular one. I've just kind of edited it. Hopefully they won't get mad at me for changing the liturgy. But just take a deep breath. And if you feel in a place to do this, just put your palms facing up on your lap so that you're in a posture of openness and letting go. In peace, we will lay down our fears and our need to rescue others. For you alone, O Lord, make us dwell in safety. Abide with us, Lord Jesus. In peace, we will love and let go. And I know your microphones aren't on, but we could say this last part together. Open hands, open hearts, generous spaces. Thank you.
Thank you so much again, Sarah and Sharon, and hopefully look forward to learning more from you in the future. So again, thanks to everyone who's tuned in for the first webinar and everyone who's watching the recording. It means a lot to us to know that you're taking this time to know how to support our community well. So yeah, thanks for the investment of time and energy. We'll see you at the next one. Bye.